In this lecture, we want to take a look at Chapter 10 on developing countries in our Essentials of Comparative Politics textbook. This chapter covers perhaps the largest regional category of nations in our text, with a broad diversity of states. Some are actually developing and some are not, as well as we see changing ideas about how to promote development. It should be noted that there is currently a renewed emphasis on political institutions among many development experts. Let's take a look at freedom and equality in the developing world. Every year on July 1st, the World Bank reclassifies countries into four main income categories: lower income, lower middle, upper middle, and high income. Our textbook groups the middle income countries together, giving the two broad categories for you to learn. The numbers on the following slides, they'll coincide with our textbook categories, which rely on gross domestic product, or GDP, which you should be familiar with. Middle income countries are historically less developed countries that have experienced significant economic growth and also democratization. They're also known as newly industrialized countries, or NICs. Per capita GDP, what we refer to as purchasing power parity of the individual in a comparison of parity with US dollars, would be between $4,000 and $13,000 annually. So that's purchasing power that the individuals have as a per capita GDP within these middle income countries. Lower income countries are countries that lack significant economic development. Often political institutionalization is low, or they lack both. So these are often known as less developed countries, or LDCs. And then per capita GDP, or the purchasing power parity, is often below $4,000 annually for every individual in equivalent US dollars. These groups of countries have been referred to in a number of different ways. During the Cold War, they were known as the Third World, part of the global division between First World, which was the advanced Western democracies, the Second World, the communist states. With the Second World largely gone now, this category no longer really makes sense. This region has also been referred to as the Global South, as many of the countries are located south of the equator. This again is inaccurate, as it leaves out other poor countries such as those in Central Asia, for example, formerly part of the former Soviet Union, or countries like Afghanistan. Experts now use the term developing, though even that's being phased out instead to focus on a country's income levels and their quality of life. So we focus on lower or middle or upper income. Table 10.1, as you can see, developing countries are found all around the world. The World Bank posted a blog in June 2023, which includes graphics such as a map of current categories and a graphic of countries that changed their category in 2023. And I've provided some links for you from the World Bank on this. A few big highlights: Guyana and American Samoa passed into the high income category. Guinea and Zambia moved from low to middle income, and Jordan actually dropped from upper to lower middle income. This demonstrates that levels of development are really a very fluid category on both ends of the spectrum. So it's better to think of development as a continuum rather than try to classify countries into really hard categories, which is what the old Third World or Global South labels did. Many differences and a few similarities when we discuss the developing world can be found. Some of the most interesting and exciting research in this region tends to focus on explaining their differences. For example, why have some countries broken out of the trap of underdevelopment and others have not? Questions like this emphasize how dynamic and changing this region of the world is, which makes it interesting to study developing countries. Many of these countries do have a legacy of imperialism, which radically changed the economic, political, and social institutions in these countries. And we'll have more on that in the next section. Imperialism and colonialism. Many but not all developing countries share this common legacy. Empires were a single political authority that has under its sovereignty a large number of external regions or territories and different peoples. Think of the broad Roman Empire. Imperialism is a system in which a state extends its power to directly control territory, its resources, and its people that are beyond its sovereign borders. For example, Great Britain, the United Kingdom, having control over India. And this type of imperialism was dominated by the European powers in the 1500s to the 1900s, and driven by economic, strategic, and cultural religious motives as well. Imperialism often led to colonialism. Colonialism is that system, an imperialist system of physically occupying a foreign territory using military force, businesses, or settlers. And if you look at the United States, we began as a colonial system, and that was part of our legacy. So to wrap up that notion of imperialism, check out your In-Focus in your textbook. Though imperialistic practices began thousands of years ago, modern imperialism emerged during the late 15th century, when technological advances, particularly advanced seafaring and military technology, allowed states in Europe, the Middle East, and Asia to project their military power overseas. It was during this period that the Ottoman Empire extended its power over the Middle East and over North Africa, but never really beyond that region. Spain and Portugal over South and Central America, and the British and French over North America, and later Asia and Africa. European powers ultimately came to dominate this historic period. For European leaders, imperialism became a means to expand their resources, markets, for the goods that they manufactured, numbers of subjects, and of course territory, all of which gave them an advantage over their European rivals. The Chinese state, meanwhile, grew conservative and inflexible, increasing its geographic isolation. By the 1500s, the Ming Dynasty actually made it illegal for Chinese subjects to build ocean-going vessels. This decision would have an important economic, social, and have political consequences for China's development, as the economy essentially stagnated over the next 400 years. As they fell behind, they themselves became the victims of imperial invasions, most notably from the British during the 1800s. Two Chinese territories, Hong Kong, formerly a British rule, Macau, which was formerly ruled by the Portuguese, were returned in 1997 and 99, respectively. Even the United States got into the imperial game during the late 1800s, early 1900s with the Spanish-American War, which ended with the U.S. taking control of several former Spanish colonies, including the Philippines and Puerto Rico. The Philippines fought their own war of independence against the United States, known as the Philippines-American War, or Tagalog Insurgency, which the Filipinos lost. Independence remained a major movement in Filipino regional politics, and the United States granted independence to this former colony in 1946 following the Second World War and after the Japanese invasion of the island. Several major wars weakened imperial rule and allowed local independence movements to succeed. The Napoleonic Wars would disrupt the Spanish and the Portuguese monopolies in Latin America, leading to a surge in independence following this European conflict. While many countries saw revolutionary wars emerge, Brazil was an interesting case, as they were awarded independence after harboring the Portuguese royal family during the Napoleonic conflict. Similarly, World War I would see the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire, based in Turkey, and the beginnings of imperial weakening in the Middle East, and World War II basically finished that job. Many parts of Asia, including India and Africa, have become independent shortly after the Second World War. Let's look at the institutions of imperialism. The major institutional changes that happened under colonialism and imperialism is exporting the state, its societal identities, and of course, resulting in dependent development in those controlled areas. One of the most significant transfers was the exportation of the concept of the state to the rest of the world. So we started drawing borders. When European countries carved up imperial territories, they were more interested in economic resources or strategic advantages than in maintaining cohesive population clusters. So in Africa, for instance, 80% of country borders were drawn based on latitude and longitude rather than population concentrations. As a result, many developing countries are highly diverse and sometimes struggle with communal conflict. That means the different ethnic, religious, or tribal factions within those drawn state borders has been problematic. There's a map in Chapter 3 of your text, Figure 3.1, which gives you the ethno-linguistic diversity in Africa. So you could take a look at that, which shows you a few country borders in Africa are actually aligned with group divides. And these are major groupings. These countries are actually considerably more divided than even this map shows. Nigeria, for instance, is comprised of over 250 officially recognized ethnic, linguistic, and religious groups. The Europeans, and then the Americans as well, began exporting state institutions. So in addition, imperial powers imported state institutions into the areas they controlled, especially the bureaucracy, to help them govern the territory and quote unquote civilize that local population. Importing the state had mixed effects. Many subjects achieved an increased education and benefited from this new infrastructure. However, this often created greater inequalities between groups. Life expectancies increased, infant mortality declined, a trend that combined with traditional family practices also led to a population explosion that many of the developing countries struggle with even today. In addition, the imposition of these structures were often incomplete or uneven, leaving these countries in institutional limbo or trapped between their traditional and Western institutions. This conflicted identity helped fuel resentment toward the colonizers, often sparking national independent movements within these colonies. Another significant change was the creation of various new identities. Importing nationalism and creating ethnicity. This is something that imperialism brought with it record keeping, including the census, and history collections such as books and museums. And these tools were used to classify the groups in the regions controlled by the imperialist countries. Though other identities such as class, vocation, tribe, and religion made more sense to native peoples at the time, imperial identities were driven by nationalism. Imperial classifications were directly exported or created to manage the territories, redefining how the populations were forced to think about themselves. Political and economic interactions were structured around these classifications, with some groups favored under imperial structures. So as a result, people who had previously not identified themselves along one category suddenly saw their basic rights and access to resources tied to how the empire defined their ethnicity. In Rwanda, for instance, the Hutu and Tutsi tribes did not exist as fully separate groups prior to the Belgian colonial experience. They had intermarried so much the tribes were physically indistinguishable. In fact, they were separated first into groups based on how many cattle each family owned and not on their ancestry. This division that was imposed and the power relations that it would create would be powerful enough to contribute to genocide in the 1990s. The importation of nationalism would be a double-edged sword for colonizers, as colonial people would later use these ideas of nationalism and self-determination to justify and inspire their own independence movements. At the same time, when colonial powers favored certain groups over others, post-independent states would redistribute power away from the groups that were preferred. During the colonial system, some newly independent countries pursued greater equality through democracy, but most actually flipped the systems of inequality and weaponized the state against the former local groups that were favored by those colonizers, leading to systems of extreme ethnic exclusion. In these countries, civil war and other forms of political violence tended to emerge, for instance, in Sri Lanka and Rwanda. Gender roles also shifted under imperialism, though it is difficult to generalize on this impact because each imperial power and each conquered region differed on gender rules themselves. So some scholars argue that imperialism improved the status of women, and often giving them better access to healthcare and education. For instance, the oppressive practice of foot binding in China largely owes its end to Western colonial influence. Again, your In Focus in your textbook summarizes the major changes of political and social institutions that resulted from imperialism and their impact on these states. Imperialism would reshape economic institutions as well. Colonies were governed to supply resources to the empire. To facilitate this resource extraction, important changes were made to their economies. Subsistence agriculture and barter were replaced with cash-based economics, allowing trade for goods and labor. Markets in these countries expanded from local barter-based economies into more connected trade economies. Free trade did not exist within colonies. Instead, goods and production were carefully regulated. Local economies produced primary commodity goods like rubber, wood, minerals, cotton, cocoa, while finished goods were imported from the factories of the imperial powers. So as a result, local economics and local economies never fully diversified or developed. Trade was also limited with the rival empires, meaning that any finished goods had to be imported from the colonial power and not from anyone else. These extractive economics and economies were often managed by large monopolies or cartels, such as the Dutch or British East India companies. Urbanization and infrastructure significantly expanded under imperialism. The focus was on improving the resource extraction capabilities of the imperial power. So goods and people moved more freely in and out of these countries. This created some economic opportunities for local populations, but population density also led to greater health problems, including more disease. So the net effect, many former colonies had economies that were designed intentionally not to be self-sufficient, but they were also left with some of the building blocks of modern trade economies. The most successful developing countries are those that have been able to overcome the first and take advantage of the second. The countries who used these tools to engage international trade in the modern era saw significant economic growth, especially over the last 30 years. The post-imperial countries, who instead decided to close themselves off from trade and attempt to reassert their economic sovereignty, instead saw their economy stagnate. Again, your book gives you an in focus to look at the economic institutions of imperialism. Let's take a look at the challenges of post-imperialism. Post-imperial countries continue to face significant political, social, and economic challenges. It's important to remember that history is not deterministic. Some countries have met these challenges very successfully. Others continue to struggle. Making broad regional comparisons, Asia has fared the best. Africa has been the worst, though some countries in Africa are bucking those trends now. And the economic growth patterns of Latin America are fairly mixed. The important question is what accounts for the differences? Let's take a look at capacity and autonomy. Capacity is the ability of the state to carry out basic tasks. And those tasks include defending the country, making and enforcing rules, managing the economy, collecting taxes, building the infrastructure that they need for a modern economy, and providing education to help with education and training of the labor force and improve productivity of workers, and of course, healthcare. Autonomy is the ability of the state to wield its power independently of the public. So when we think about these developing countries, we want to think about whether or not they have the capacity and the autonomy to begin to control their future destiny in a positive way economically. So what are some of the challenges for capacity? Following imperialism and the pullout of imperial administrators from the institutions that were developed in these developing countries, many of those countries lacked a professional bureaucracy with the knowledge to carry out state governance tasks. Those were done by the imperial powers. So this problem was exacerbated by the tendency of post-imperial leaders in these states to turn the bureaucracies into an important source of jobs, resources, and benefits, allowing them to co-opt their populations. So civil servants became a major source of clientelism, and rent-seeking and corruption really remains a significant development challenge for many of these countries. So let's look at the challenges to creating autonomy. Authoritarianism is common in many of these countries, which may give us the mistaken notion that the state is highly autonomous or able to function without consulting the public. However, many of these states are dominated by patrimonial systems, which means that the state is not an independent actor, but instead captured by certain groups who see it as a resource to be exploited for personal gain rather than a tool for achieving national policy. Extreme versions of this are sometimes labeled kleptocracy, literally rule by theft. So kleptocracy is rule by theft. One example is Nigeria. During the military rule of the 90s, Nigerian officials stole over $1 billion from their state treasury. Such a diversion of resources degrades state autonomy and undermines state capacity. So think about what a developing state like Nigeria might have done with their economy if they had an additional $1 billion. In addition, more powerful states and international actors like the United Nations, the World Bank, multinational corporations, non-governmental organizations like Amnesty International or the Red Cross, they have considerable economic and political resources within these countries. While some of their work may be well-intentioned, these powerful actors shape the military and diplomatic alliances, the trade relations, the local economies, and domestic laws of developing countries, often undermining sovereignty and reducing those states' autonomy. So challenges to building a solid state and growing the economy are that state autonomy and the capacity building that you have within countries. So these are some of the biggest problems that are faced by developing countries. All of the problems associated with weak states' capacity and autonomy to some extent are important to look at. We'll talk more about one of these problems, corruption, in a little bit. It's important to remember that while these problems begin with domestic politics, they often have an international impact. Civil wars can spill over borders and destabilize an entire region. States with increased criminality can provide havens for international crime, including drug and human trafficking. While some developed democracies struggle with corruption, this problem is more acute in developing countries. So when state bureaucracies are politicized, the rule of law is broken, and/or state institutions are poorly run, bribe culture becomes a means to bypass formal institutions with informal relationships and keep economies moving. However, these bribe cultures tend to increase inequality, as only the wealthy and already connected politically can afford the necessary bribes to function in these economies. As we see here in Table 10.2, 2021 data from Transparency International, we can see the corruption index. Countries like Denmark and the United States, Canada, France, even South Africa are the least corrupt. And then we look at the bottom of this list at the most corrupt countries, with Somalia being the most with a score of 178. And even India makes the top 10. There are challenges of creating nations and citizens, and the problem that results from the political line drawing that imperial powers did, especially in places like Africa and the Middle East. It's a challenge to build a single national identity in highly diverse societies. Migration during the colonial period further diversified societal groups and social hierarchies within these colonial states. And also, of course, we need to address gender inequalities in many of these countries. But keep in mind that diversity by itself is not necessarily bad. Ethnic peace is actually the norm in most societies. But we can look at some of the causes of ethnic and religious divides, like group-based wealth inequality, the political dominance of one group over others, and clientelism or patrimonialism, which increases ethnic disparities. This is where one group dominates the state and freezes out others from that political process. If we look at some examples of these patrimonial systems, Mexico is one example, and it has historically been dominated by citizens of European origin, while those of indigenous descent are largely shut out of politics and/or economic opportunities. In the second Sunni rule over the Shia majority in Iran, while the majority of the Iraqi population is Shia, this country was historically controlled by the Sunni minority, especially under the regime of Saddam Hussein. But following the U.S. invasion of Iraq, sectarian violence erupted between Sunni and Shia populations, and the terrorist group Al-Qaeda in Iraq would later become ISIS in the region, would also be a major instigator of this violence between these two groups. The third example, in Syria, the Alawite minority have historically dominated politics in Syria, leading to resentments that fueled the Syrian civil war. Civil wars are especially damaging both internally and externally. The Syrian civil war, for example, has cut the country's economic growth potential roughly in half since it began, and it has created one of the largest refugee crises in the modern era. While Europeans and Americans have expressed concerns and sometimes outright hostility about taking in this refugee population, the brunt of the crisis has been borne by neighboring states. As of June 2020, Turkey had well over 3.5 million refugees from this conflict. And while the tiny country Lebanon, whose population before the Syrian war was somewhere between 4 and 5 million, now has a little less than 1 million Syrian refugees registered with the UN Commission on Refugees. We'll see what happens now that the Syrian conflict seems to be over internally, but still, this has created problems beyond its border. A fourth example, Arab dominance of Sudan led to a 30-year civil war and the partition of the state into Sudan and South Sudan, and both countries have been engaging in violence in recent years. Starting with this first challenge, this in focus box highlights the legacies of colonialism in creating a weak foundation for a state in building a common national or patriotic identity. Many former colonies are highly diverse societies, and building a national identity that unites so many different ethnic, linguistic, and religious groups can prove to be challenging. So as discussed in your textbook, when the social divisions and polarization are too much, this can weaken the notion of citizenship, that all individuals have a common political relationship within the state. This can result in a politically disengaged population, which can then become easy victims of non-democratic leaders, and at the most extremes, become the impetus for political violence. Turning to the issues of women's rights in the developing world, while in the West we tend to view this issue as a debate over fair pay or funding of school sports programs, women's inequality in developing countries often deny women basic political and economic rights. At the extreme, it also proves deadly. Your book mentions sex selection in places like India and China, but on the global scale, an estimated 140 million women are believed to be missing. In contrast, the casualty rate for World War II is roughly 70 million soldiers and civilians. So this is a major problem. One major post-colonial legacy has been economics and laws that favor male labor and property rights. Even societies that have attempted reform to improve women's rights often face difficulties in putting these laws into practice. They often face resistance, especially among poor or rural men. This slide I put in here because it does expand on the previous slide about the causes and consequences of women's economic exclusion in a real world country, as we look at Nicaragua. Nicaragua is a good example of a society that has struggled with this issue. Women played a pivotal role in the Sandinista revolution and were able to use their political leverage to pass a series of reforms in the 1980s and 1990s to encourage women's joint ownership of land that they farmed with their husbands. However, in rural areas, families seldom prepare wills, so land would often transfer without clear sense of whether it belonged to the wife inheriting from her father or the husband. Or rural men would refuse to draw up legal documents that would share their land with their wives or daughters, perceiving this as a threat to their authority. If women inherit land, plots are often smaller than land inherited by their brothers and often the least agriculturally productive. Because rural Nicaraguan women are in a weak legal and economic situation, it makes it easy for husbands to use this as a tool of domestic abuse. Men will beat or cheat on their wives and threaten to kick them off the land, including property inherited from their father, if a woman decides to leave their husband. After independence, many former colonies found themselves still dependent on their former empires. Their economies had been structured so much toward producing primary commodities that they lacked the capacity to produce many finished or manufactured goods, meaning they still needed to import them. Since finished goods are valued more than primary commodities, for instance, a gold ring is worth more than the gold it's made out of, or cotton is worth less than the textiles that are made out of the cotton, these countries suffered from a perpetual trade imbalance. So rather than starting with a clean slate, post-colonial economies instead had to dig their way out of a hole that was already created for them. So many countries, including the United States, this represented a new indirect form of imperialism called neocolonialism, and breaking this cycle became a major goal of developing countries. For the United States, at the end of the Revolutionary War, Alexander Hamilton, of course, engaged in trade protectionism to keep those manufactured goods from the UK that we had been so accustomed to trading our commodities of cotton and tobacco in return for the textiles, for example, from the UK. He wanted to protect our infant industries so that they could build up manufacturing base here in the United States. This is something that's very similar with many of these post-imperial countries and colonial countries following the Second World War. In trying to grow their economies, different developing countries tried one or more of these paths. Import substitution or export-oriented industrialization. These are also known as structural adjustment programs. Import substitution believed that sheltering domestic producers from the neo-colonial system would allow them to develop and ultimately compete on a more even footing. It was implemented in several Latin American countries. In fact, it was first developed by an Argentine economist. Africa and parts of Asia, most notably India, also adopted this until the 1990s. The policies, tariffs, and other trade barriers made imported goods more expensive, forcing domestic consumers to buy domestically made goods. Companies, especially large firms that employed a lot of people, received substantial state support or were even partially parastatal or fully government owned. As it's briefly mentioned in your textbook, many of these countries also relaxed or outright removed any copyright regulations. While the original intent was to make it easier for domestic producers to copy and catch up with foreign producers, it also allowed domestic producers and sometimes consumers to steal from each other, even internally, undermining the incentive for companies to innovate. An interesting example of this is the issue of piracy in Bollywood in India, which had a negative impact on the film industry. The major perpetrators of movie piracy in India was not the criminals, but rival publishing houses seeking to undermine their competitors' profits. So it was not helping them to compete with Hollywood in the United States, but was undermining even their own work within their domestic economy. So let's look at import substitution and evaluate it. In practice, this model is widely considered to be a failure. It provides business inefficiency, corruption, poverty, and it creates a middle income trap. So when it comes to inefficiency, protected firms become inefficient and reliant on state money. And it became difficult to import goods and that lack of consumer goods drive up prices and made citizens much poorer. And the connection between business and the state increased corruption. Companies producing manufactured goods also faced significant economic challenges. Ironically, the import barriers that were supposed to help firms develop actually made it harder, since they had trouble importing the tools they needed to operate their assembly lines and do so efficiently. Firms depended on government policy or these trade barriers for their ability to make a profit, so they had large incentives to actually bribe officials, so corruption went up. Even if this policy helped employment, consumer goods were more expensive, meaning that people's money didn't go as far as one would have liked. So this was because of the tariffs and other trade barriers, which made imported or international products more expensive, and domestic businesses either one, could charge more for their products, or two, didn't have the incentive to innovate in a way that would make their production of these goods more cost effective or more desirable for the consumer. So goods shortages and a loss of consumer spending power were the outcome of these import substitution policies. Because consumers were poor, they couldn't buy as much, which in turn hurt local producers, fueling a poverty cycle. Overall, this policy seems to have contributed to a higher tendency for these countries to either stagnate economically, such as India's economy. It essentially flatlined for about 40 years under this policy of import substitution, or fall into that middle income trap, a situation wherein countries experience economic growth but are unable to develop at a speed necessary to catch up with developed countries. In contrast to import substitution, export-oriented industrialization sought to connect their economies more heavily to international trade. Many Asian, especially East Asian countries, adopted this model. Famous examples are South Korea, China, and Singapore. The policies? Strategic state interventions targeted toward producing goods intended for international trade or exports. These included capitalizing on the product life cycle. Basically, a good takes a great deal of time and resources to initially produce or to innovate. But as its use spreads, other producers figure out how to make it cheaper and often more efficient or more cost effective than the original producer. So combining the product life cycle with the trend toward economic globalization, these countries could take advantage of their low levels of development. Less development meant their labor costs were also lower. So they can produce basic goods such as textiles cheaper than can international competitors. They can then use the profits from these more basic goods to further modernize the economy, expanding their production into cheap electronics, cars, toys, and ultimately the high-tech industry. This policy involves state investments in key industries. So in South Korea, Chaebols worked with the state to make sure that capital stayed in the country, available for expanding firms that were engaged in exports. Not mentioned in your textbook, but other policies associated with export-oriented industrialization include relaxing copyright regulations, similar to import substitution strategies, and increasing capital by allowing favorable deals for foreign direct investment. These may be policies that we should consider, especially if we want to discuss things like the tensions that can emerge between countries when one trading partner ignores copyright protections used by another country to protect their domestic innovators. The United States has had to deal with this, as well as Europe, with these export-oriented industrialized countries in Asia who fail to protect American or European companies' trademarks and copyrights. It's been a big problem for the past 50 years, as well as to make sure that the rules are transparent and allow for the foreign investor to invest in the country. So one way to court foreign investment that was used by Singapore and China is to create special economic zones, areas where trade, taxation, and investment laws were significantly different from those of the rest of the country, and where government investment is much higher. Foreign investors were drawn to these regions, into these special economic zones or SEZs, because the likelihood of profit is much higher and economic risks are partially offset by government spending. I'll post a link to a list that has a map of these Chinese SEZs in your Canvas. While this slide here goes beyond your textbook, I think it's helpful for you to understand some of the nuance around export-oriented industrialization policy, and appreciate that there is really no one path to growth. Economies that used export orientation clearly outperformed economies using import substitution, but it also is a model that has its own challenges. The tight mercantilist relationship between the government and the key strategic businesses does risk becoming a clientelist relationship and prone to corruption. South Korea is a good example of that. In addition, there's considerable long-term viability question to the strategy. It doesn't take many government resources to subsidize cheap clothing manufacturing, but extensive subsidies for high-tech firms can quickly deplete government budgets. So this cost-effectiveness issue becomes even more immediate as the natural progression of labor costs lead to increases over time. We see that workers demand higher pay. So, especially if they're doing more complicated jobs. So there's this natural progression of the cost of labor. It continues to increase. Companies can no longer benefit from a low-cost workforce as a way to capitalize on the product life cycle. Excuse me. To try to maintain their trade competitiveness, states may decide to pursue strict capital controls to keep their value of the currency lower. Thus, the value of goods a country produces will remain down, so cheaper for foreign buyers to purchase those goods exported from these developing countries. Because of global finance and currency investment, currency values are more difficult to control now than ever before. And this can trigger resentment from trading partners. For instance, the United States has accused China of devaluing their currency to gain an unfair trade advantage by artificially keeping the cost of their goods lower. Finally, since the economy is structured so that goods are focused on international rather than domestic consumption, this reduces the economic diversity of an economy and increases their dependence on international trade. If suddenly demand for their goods dries up, as happened to China in the 2008 financial crisis and the 2020 global slowdown surrounding coronavirus, this has a strong impact on their economy. With a lack of goods and services geared to domestic markets, a country can be hard hit by financial shocks that happen globally. By the 1980s, many developing countries, either those using import substitution or who still focused on primary commodity production like agriculture, faced deep economic problems, including high levels of government debt. This required them to seek help from two international organizations, the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, or the IMF. The World Bank loans money to countries to allow them to fund international development projects. It's particularly focused on infrastructure development, which is good for the country's overall economy. While the IMF is considered a lender of last resort when a government is about to go bankrupt. But these loans had strings attached. As organizations run by Western countries, especially the United States, and their economists, they heavily favored what we called neoliberal economic policies. So they believed in liberalization of the economy in order to help it grow itself out of a situation of debt. The theory behind structural adjustment is that the policies may hurt the country in the short term, as old uncompetitive industries die away and unemployment is likely to increase as the production falls off, but opening the country up to market forces should create more sustainable long-term growth. So structural adjustment programs focused on a policy of economic liberalization, adopted in exchange for financial support from liberal organizations like the IMF and World Bank. And these would typically include privatizing state-run firms, ending subsidies paid out to domestic manufacturers, reducing tariff barriers to allow more competition on trade, and then, of course, shrinking the size of the state and being more open to foreign investment. The goal of structural adjustment programs is to minimize government intervention to allow a more free market to emerge. And this policy tool reflects this. While structural adjustment programs have faced a lot of criticism, they did make a lot of sense for some countries, like India. The heavily bureaucratic import substitution state of India was stifling innovation in local businesses and fueling inequalities. In fact, many people attributed India's recent economic success to the dual policies of the Green Revolution, of agricultural technology sharing that greatly reduced India's widespread problem of famine, and that neoliberal reforms begun under Rajiv Gandhi and strengthened under India's IMF loan in the early 90s. Poland and Chile are similar success stories. In the decade of 2000 to 2010, 6 of the 10 fastest growing economies in the world were in sub-Saharan Africa, many of which follow this economic model. In fact, some economists argue that free market reforms may have played a role in the recent African growth miracle. In contrast, other countries that instituted this policy, including other African countries, saw their debt increase and political instability emerge, triggering further political and economic crises. In 1977, just under 100 people were killed following the IMF riots in Egypt after the government reduced subsidies for consumers to purchase food staples as part of the IMF requirements. More recently, some experts have warned that austerity measures in Greece, forced on them by the IMF and the European Union as a correction for their debt crisis, may have actually worsened the Greek economy. There are a lot of instances in which mass protests have erupted following reforms that end or scale back popular programs, even when those programs are harmful to the economy as a whole. Partly because, in aggregate and over the long term, these liberal economic prescriptions from the IMF and the World Bank may be good for the economy. But in the short term, anecdotally, an individual feels that change as it happens in a negative way. In other countries, this policy significantly worsened poverty and collapsed economies. Cutting government funding to health or education undermines human capital. In countries prone to diseases like malaria, fewer government-funded hospitals weakened the productivity of the workforce. Weakening state capacity also negatively impacted the ability of countries to respond to natural disasters, which is a major concern in countries due to the luck of geography, prone to earthquakes, storms, or other natural disasters. And finally, it's hard to lure manufacturing in a country that lacks electricity, ports, or a functioning rail system. All of these economic building blocks are public goods, which are generally things governments, not private citizens or businesses, provide. Even some supporters of this policy agree that it is a good policy when poor governance or corruption are a serious problem, but that it cannot fix an economy that struggles with the health crisis or lacks proper education or social support. In those cases, critics would argue, structural adjustment programs may make the economy worse by undermining a country's human capital. And by human capital, we mean an economic argument that a healthy, educated workforce is a desirable resource that can be used by firms to grow their business, because a healthy and educated or trained workforce has higher rates of productivity in the business when they go to work. So in summary, SAPs, the structural adjustment programs, may be a good fix for some countries, but they may be found to be detrimental in others. So, wrapping it up, your book in Focus points to the 3 paths for economic growth: the import substitution, export-oriented industrialization, and the use of structural adjustment programs and the support financially from the more advanced countries to support changes that could, but not necessarily, bring about growth in developing countries. So let's look at the puzzles and prospects for democracy and development. Developing countries have some major challenges, but many have seen amazing improvements over the past few decades. So From the textbook, here are just a few examples of amazing change that has occurred in some developing countries over the past couple of decades. In 1960, the average life expectancy in India was the age of 43. In Brazil, only 54. As of 2021, these averages had increased to the age 70 in India and 76 in Brazil. As recently as 1990, the infant mortality rate in Indonesia was 84 deaths per 1,000. In 2021, that rate of infant mortality had dropped to just 20 in 1,000. Between 2000 and 2020, the GDP in sub-Saharan Africa increased fivefold from $400 billion to $1.9 trillion. So growth is happening. The benefits of a growing economy have had impacts on the people in those countries. Some countries are being left behind, but and if you look at development economist Paul Collier, who describes 5 specific poverty traps in his book Bottom Billion, he notes that these include the conflict trap, the natural resource trap, and bad governance trap, which is not listed in your textbook. It's the landlocked, with bad neighbors trap, which combines poor geography with conflict in a neighboring country. We want to take a look here at making a more effective state. So during the 1960s and 70s, many state governments acted as major barriers to growth, as corrupt officials siphoned off resources. This led to the rise of the Washington Consensus, which sought to weaken these dysfunctional governments in favor of free market forces. However, smaller was not better if basic public needs were not met. The new development approach is to focus on good governance and improve the rule of law, reduce corruption, improve healthcare, increase economic growth, and make sure basic needs are being met for the populations. How best to achieve this, though, often depends on the major challenges faced by each country, because there really is no one-size-fits-all model for economic development. To fight corruption and poor governance, citizens need to be able to hold their leaders accountable for bad actions. Encouraging citizen participation, especially through an active civil society, is considered a major part of this goal. The big question is how to use civil society in a way that builds this accountability. One way groups can expand their membership and reach out to people is to focus on local issues. In addition, expanding mass media, television, radio, cell phones, other forms of communication, and social media in developing countries can help civil society groups bring their message to the population, assuming those sources of information are kept free and not overly regulated by the government. Critics caution that an overly powerful civil society in a weak state can actually worsen the abuse of power. Organized groups can be a tempting target for clientelist policies, where political leaders can buy off local groups in return for political support. Interwar Germany has been cited as an example of a country with a vibrant civil society alongside a weak state. This is between World War I and World War II. And the Soviet Union can be viewed as another example where growing civil society did not simply bring down the regime, but fractured the state as well. More recently, Hungary's civil society has been co-opted by the Fidesz party using nationalist rhetoric and xenophobia. Some civil society groups have become supporters of policies that are reducing government transparency, accountability, and democracy in Hungary. Developing countries tend to have very large have a very large informal economy, which is often dominated by self-employed and small enterprises like street vendors. These tend to be very flexible economic opportunities and are often available for those who have been denied access to traditional economic resources, such as banking or property ownership. Women in developing countries tend to comprise a large portion of this informal economy. So this is a sector that does have the potential to empower women. Informal economies are often associated with weak states that are unable to effectively regulate the economy or prevent corruption. And in this environment, state and government officials often capitalize on their authority by demanding bribes from business owners to ease their way through regulations. The larger the informal economy, the less revenue the state can collect in taxes. And as a result, states have less money to invest in institutions that could benefit their overall economy, such as infrastructure investment, schools, or healthcare. Finally, because of state weakness in managing markets and property, which may include things like effective civil law courts or to help handle financial disputes, civil disagreements between businesses, it is much harder for businesses to scale up into larger firms. The three policies mentioned above, import substitution, export-oriented industrialization, and neoliberal or liberal structural adjustment programs, are largely macro in their approach, especially as they focus on the role of states in structuring economies. Some development advocates have argued that we need to switch from state-run development strategies to more bottom-up microeconomic approaches, focusing less on macroeconomic stability of the entire economy, but focus on microeconomic approaches for development. The hope of these policies is that by expanding small-scale business in the informal economy, it will create enough of a ripple effect on the entire economy. In many ways, this is an extension of neoliberal policies and theories. One policy that has received considerable attention is microcredit, which is part of a broader microfinance institution. Under microcredit, small loans are channeled to the poor who lack access to traditional lending institutions through borrowing groups. However, research on microcredit so far suggests that this policy fails to significantly impact a country's economy. One study that does find a relationship between microcredit and poverty reduction argues that microcredit is only effective in some countries. Specifically, microcredit relies on political stability, a very strong rule of law, and stable economic regulations to have a positive impact. This finding demonstrates that even local bottom-up solutions require some top-down resources to make it all work. Other research has found that microcredit may make the situation worse for some borrowers. Because the poor are considered high risk, microlending institutions often charge extremely high interest rates on any loans, meaning that lenders have to make enough profit to cover their initial loan plus the interest charges. And many fail to make the profit and instead taking out additional microloans to pay off the past microloans, entering into a spiral of debt from which it is difficult for the individuals to recover. A second policy option has been the Millennium Villages, a project developed by the Earth Institute of Columbia University and the United Nations Development Program. This program gave 14 small communities in Africa targeted interventions ranging from crop production and improved education to the distribution of bed nets to reduce malaria. The exact impact of the Millennium Villages is under debate, and one assessment of the project found that only some of the health goals were actually reached. There is at least a tentative support that the villages that were part of this program did see improvements in agriculture and health, though nutrition and education was inconclusive. Most of us have visited a grocery store and have seen the marketing campaigns for, fair trade products, particularly coffee is one good example. And your chapter starts with the debate over fair trade certification. One recent study on fair trade in Ethiopia and Uganda uncovered disturbing findings. Many involved in the production of fair trade goods were not farm workers, but hired workers, including children who made less than those on non-fair trade farms. Premiums tended to go to the minority running larger firms, so few small farmers and laborers saw any benefit from this trading relationship. Schools, clinics, and other benefits built by the cooperatives were often denied to the wage laborers. The big question remains, are these patterns unique to Ethiopia and Uganda, or is this sort of inequality and exploitation more problematic of the entire fair trade system? it is certainly a great idea for the private sector to try to reach out to developing countries and provide better access to our lucrative international markets in things like coffee by making sure that our money that we're spending goes to those who do the work and can benefit from it at that microeconomic level. Why did Asia industrialize faster than Latin America? There are several possible explanations for why Asia grew faster. Geostrategic is one possibility. The U.S. influence in Latin America is more neo-colonial, while the United States saw development in Asian countries as a way to combat the threat of communism. Here in Latin America, that wasn't as much the case, so our involvement was much less. And then, of course, there's land ownership and reform. Latin America was dominated by large landholders and estates left over from colonialism. In Asia, one of the first reforms was to break up the landed elites' monopolies and redistribute this land to more peasant producers. Both explanations have flaws, though it does appear that legacies of colonialism do seem to have a stronger hold in Latin America than they do in Asian societies. So in sum, there are a lot of challenges to development. Developing countries are very diverse groups that includes both middle and lower income countries. While there are many differences between these countries, most of them share this common legacy of imperial rule, where imperialism has shaped the country's political, social, and economic institutions. And these countries still struggle with building capacity and autonomy for their own state. And these political challenges continue to undermine economic and social stability in many of them. Regarding social cohesion, some developing countries still struggle to overcome ethnic and religious divides and gender inequality within their own states. Following the end of imperialism, different states used one or more of the following policies to grow their economies: the import substitution path, the export-oriented industrialization path, or structural adjustment programs, particularly for many of them that transferred from the old communist socialist economies of the Warsaw Pact and Soviet Union into more free market societies. Major goals for developing states today are creating more effective governance, developing political engagement, and promoting economic growth. So there's really no one-size-fits-all policy to achieving any of our development goals. I want to finish this lecture with this slide. The middle income trap suggests that while it may be easy for poor countries to boost their economies, it is much harder for them to sustain growth, to bring them to a high income level. For countries like South Korea, who have managed to escape this trap, investing in higher education and improving the rule of law, which is both protecting individual rights as well as property rights, seem to have definitely helped a great deal.